Good evening, everyone. Today we'll be discussing the contents of week 11, which pertains to homeostasis, how homeostasis is maintained in the body, followed by some questions related to that. Let me just share my screen. Please stop me if you have any questions during any portion. Okay. So, in the past few weeks, we have learned about how various organisms are classified, how they have evolved from lower organisms, and what is the basic building block of any organ or organism, which are cells, which molecules these cells are made up of, what are the cellular processes that involve these molecules or are useful for functioning of the cells. We have learned different systems that are part of a living organism. So, for life to be maintained for any living being, all of these are very essential. The living being needs nutrients, oxygen if they are aerobic in nature. They need water, normal body temperature. This is important especially for warm-blooded animals where the temperature is maintained within a very short range. For cold-blooded animals, the external temperature is the one that affects their body temperature. They have slightly less control than warm-blooded animals or homeotherms, and appropriate atmospheric pressure. For example, if if a living organism which is present here at sea level is placed very deep inside the sea, they may or may not be able to survive in that area because the pressure in that area is too high for the body to adjust, because the body is used to certain atmospheric pressures and all of the processes are maintained according to that pressure. If it's placed at a higher pressure, it might change the reactions that occur within the body. If you are looking at the physiology of any living being, and depending on how complex the living being is, the complexity of all of these organ systems increase. So, we have looked at digestion, circulatory system, muscular system. Digestion is important for uptake of nutrients and how the nutrients are processed. Circulatory system is important for how the nutrients are circulated through the body, how various things are transferred from one place to another, how the oxygen carbon dioxide balance is maintained in the body. The respiratory system also sort of plays into this. Muscular system is very important for locomotion. Nervous system is very important if there is information transfer required from one place to another inside the body. Both excretory and endocrine systems are very important for maintaining the state of the body. Whichever state the body is in, depending on the environment, if the environment is the same, then the body would like to maintain in that state in a good state until if the environment changes, then the state of the body needs to change. So excretory system and endocrine system both play a very important role in maintaining whatever state the body is in. Which brings us to homeostasis, which literally means unchanging. So what homeostasis means is you maintain one stable state, relatively stable state of the internal environment, which is inside the body. It does not matter how much the external conditions change. If the external conditions are changing, the body needs to have mechanisms in place to bring it back to the stable state. The homeostatic mechanisms that are in place in the body allows allow for changes within some narrow limits like plus or minus 1 or plus or minus 0.5. And there is a dynamic equilibrium in place when it comes to homeostasis. So there are multiple mechanisms of regulation. There is auto-regulation or intrinsic regulation, which is an automatic response in a cell, tissue or organ to some environmental change. Extrinsic regulation is responses controlled by nervous system and endocrine system. So the auto-regulation or intrinsic regulation happens in a more localized manner, whereas extrinsic regulation may happen at a more vast rate. Okay, so this is how the homeostatic machinery plays out. If there is a stimulus which is essentially a deviation from the set point. Set point is the normal value. This is the normal. For example, if you are looking at blood pressure, the set point is 120/80 for most people. If you are looking at temperature, the set point would be 98.6. The set point is, when I say these values, these are the average values recorded by measuring multiple individuals. The set point might differ a little bit from individual to individual depending on how their body is. For example, certain people have slightly higher body temperatures. Some people might have slightly lower, their normal blood pressure might be slightly lower than 120/80. So the set point is a individual thing. It might, if whatever values are normal for the individual, if that changes, there is a deviation, then this would act like a stimulus. And this error is measured by the sensor. This sensor can be any receptor that senses the change in the stimulus. Then comes the integrator, which compares the signal from which is sensed by the sensor to the set point, which is the normal value for that individual. And this is usually a part in the brain. The effector is usually an organ or tissue which now knows that, yeah, the current condition is very different from the set point and we need to bring it back to the set point. So the effector comes into play. It does certain things to get the deviation to 0. Then there is response, that is the change that occurs due to the effector, and the result is that you have restored the set point again. So if if the result is such that it brings, if the result is the result can affect the result can also act as a stimulus. If the result is such that it is further deviating the whatever value it is from the set point, then it's a positive feedback loop where it is increasing the deviation. Whereas if it's trying to get it back to 0, trying to get the deviation back to 0, it's a negative feedback loop. So negative feedback systems are more common. It essentially reverses the change. So the point of negative feedback loop is you get the deviation to 0. It results in fluctuations about the set point. Examples are body temperature. If you are in a very warm place, the body sweats so as to get the temperature down. If you are in a very cold place, then the body tries to shiver to increase the temperature. It causes vasoconstriction, which is essentially whatever blood vessels are near the skin, the blood flow to those portions are restricted so that there is no heat loss due to the blood vessels. Positive feedback systems are very rare. In this case, the change is amplified. So whatever result you get here, that's going to act as a stimulus again, and it is going to enhance the result again. Examples are infection in the body. When you are generating antibodies, the antibodies, if you remember, the antibodies would increase in a in a fashion like this, where it will finally saturate, but in this portion the antibodies act as a kind of a positive feedback system. Okay. For negative, the mechanism for negative feedback system is that the body will compare whatever the current value is to the ideal normal value. There is some range of error which is fine, but if the current value is more than it lies beyond the range of error as well, then it is going to then the negative feedback system is going to kick in. So, set point is the ideal normal value for a variable. For example, for body temperature, the average value is 98.6. Error is the values that are still normal values that are not the set point. That essentially is a range. If the variation is that much, the system is not fine-tuned enough, or the system can ignore that much of variation. There is a normal range of values or error for any homeostatic feedback system in the body. And for example, for temperature, plus or minus 0.5 or plus or minus 1 is considered to be fine. So the negative feedback homeostasis occurs when a change in one direction produces a change in other. Essentially, if there is a rise in body temperature, the feedback system will try to bring it down. If there is a drop in body temperature, the feedback system will try to get it up. So this is essentially opposite feedback. This is essentially opposite feedback mechanism of positive feedback, which is responsible for reversing the stimulus by activating opposite responses that leads to reduced productivity of the stimulus. This is very important for maintaining a constant internal environment or maintaining the homeostasis. This is the mechanism that is in place which makes homeotherms or warm-blooded animal as they are. Examples of this are regulation of body temperature, blood pH, which tries to stay around 7.4 to 7.6, hormone levels, oxygen, carbon dioxide balance. It makes sure that the blood, this also ties into the blood pH. If there is a lot of carbon dioxide in the blood, it's going to make the blood more acidic. Blood sugar levels, if blood sugar levels fluctuate, insulin or glucagon might kick in to make sure that the blood sugar levels are kept down. Blood pressure, acid-base balance, osmoregulation, calcium homeostasis, energy balance, all of these are examples of negative feedback homeostasis. For example, if the body temperature exceeds 37 degrees Celsius, then the nerve cells skin in the skin and brain signal the temperature regulatory center in the brain, which signals the sweat glands to start producing sweat to get the temperature down. So in this case, the body temperature is the stimulus, nerve cells are the sensor, and the temperature regulatory sensor is the control, sweat glands are the effector. Okay. If, as I said, if the blood glucose levels fluctuate, then the insulin glucagon levels might change to make sure that the blood glucose level is maintained. So usually for healthy individuals, the blood glucose lies from 70 to 110 mg per deciliter of blood in a fasting condition. If this is beyond that, then it's called a diabetic condition or a pre-diabetic condition. The glucose present in the blood is very essential for cellular respiration to generate ATP, which will act as the energy reserve for the rest of the body, and it is very essential for brain function. Constant levels of very high sugar in the blood is also not very healthy, because it is going to start affecting other organ systems. So if the blood glucose level fluctuates, then the pancreas, which has alpha beta cell, different kinds of cells that each of which is specific to secrete different kinds of hormones, start secreting certain molecules that make sure that the blood glucose level is maintained in this range. This is also true after you eat a meal. It is true if you are if you haven't eaten a meal in a very long time, then the body starts using the reserves inside it to make sure that the blood glucose level is maintained at its optimal state. So, if there is a rise in blood glucose level, say 120 mg per deciliter, especially after you have had some food, then the beta cells of Langerhans start secreting insulin into the blood. The insulin then signals the body cells, adipose, liver, skeletal muscles, all of these to take up the glucose by converting it into glycogen. Then this results in a drop in the blood glucose level. So in this case, the increase in blood glucose acts as the stimulus. Beta cells can act as sensor and integrator. The rest of the body will act as the effector. Liver, skeletal muscle cells, uptake of glucose, all of this constitutes the response, and finally the result is a lowering of blood glucose level. If there is a increase in the temperature of the body, then the thermoreceptors in the skin and hypothalamus sense this. Hypothalamus then signals the skin, blood vessels and sweat glands to make sure that to ensure that the body temperature comes down. The response is that the blood vessels in the skin vasodilate, and this releases heat from the surface. The sweat glands in the skin release heat as sweat. This decreases the body temperature by sheer evaporation. So, two terms which you might encounter is vasodilation and vasoconstriction. Vasodilation means when the blood vessels are, the diameter of the cross section of the blood vessels, diameter of the cross section is increasing, whereas vasoconstriction means when the diameter is decreasing. Next comes positive feedback homeostasis. In this case, the output, the stimulus is such that it results in an output that differs from the set point even more. So, in response to an output variation which causes the output to vary even more in the direction of the initial deviation. So, if there is an increase, it will start increasing in even more. If there is a decrease, then the decrease will, the result is such that the decrease increases even more. So, what it does is, it promotes change to proceed for further change, which amplifies until the removal of the stimulus. This is very important, especially for reinforcement of any particular stimulus inside the body. Examples of this are childbirth, where if the child is being pushed, child's head is pushed towards to push downwards, then this induces the release of oxytocin, which stimulates further contractions, which makes sure that pressure is created and the downward motion of the child is maintained. So the contractions the contractions then further increase the release of oxytocin, and this keeps happening until the pressure in the cervix is released. Lactation also follows positive feedback homeostasis, wherein if there is suckling, suckling at the breast, then the milk production is stimulated. Once the baby stops feeding, then the milk production stops. Ovulation also is a positive feedback homeostasis, wherein the release of estrogen by the dominant follicle inside of the ovary stimulates the release of FSH and LH, which are two hormones very essential for ovulation, which further stimulates the growth of the follicle. Blood clotting is also a positive feedback homeostasis, wherein activated platelets release clotting factors which stimulate aggregation of even more platelets at the site of injury. So the initial group of platelets sort of act like a nucleation site for other platelets to come in and start aggregating. Fruit ripening is also a positive feedback homeostasis. Ethylene, which is released by ripened fruits, ethylene also acts as a hormone, is further stimulates the ripening of nearby fruits. So if, for example, you place a very ripe fruit inside a box of unripe fruits, then other fruits start ripening because of production of ethylene. Okay. What are some differences between positive and negative homeostasis? The positive feedback homeostasis essentially results in the amplification of the signal, whereas negative results in inhibition of the signal. This inhibition of output signal. Uh, the positive feedback strengthens the stimulus with increasing productivity, whereas the negative feedback reduces the effect of the signal with decreasing productivity. This is a very less frequent process. It is very specific to certain events that would happen within the lifetime of any individual, whereas negative feedback homeostasis is a more frequent process. The positive feedback homeostasis is not very much concerned with the stability of the system, rather completing a process, whereas negative feedback homeostasis is concerned more for getting the state back to the stable state. We have already discussed the examples of that. So both of these are equally important. It's not that negative is more important than positive. It depends on what context these are used in. And both of these are important for maintaining the environment inside the body. So, if there is a disturbance, then the homeostatic mechanism makes sure that there is a readjustment which leads to regulation. This regulation can happen at two levels, endocrine and excretory. Endocrine is more involved in coordination between all of the organ systems, whereas excretory system is involved with the water balance and throwing out all of the waste metabolites. Okay. Are there any questions till now? Okay. Please stop me to ask questions if there are any. Okay. The endocrine system acts essentially as a control system for homeostasis. If there is anything going wrong, then it will kick in various feedback mechanisms in place to make sure that the body goes back to the feedback mechanism to the stable state. So, so there are endocrine glands, there are exocrine glands. What endocrine glands mean is these are ductless glands. So they don't secrete the whatever molecules they have synthesized into a specific place using ducts. Rather, they secrete it into the bloodstream, and then the molecules that the endocrine system has made can go to the appropriate organ system which has the receptor for these hormones. So most of the endocrine glands secrete molecules which are called as hormones. So it can be endocrine. Hormones are mostly endocrine in nature because the site of synthesis is not usually the site of action. So what usually happens is, for example, if a hormone is getting secreted by the adrenal glands, then it is not necessary that the adrenal cortex is the place where the hormones act. They can act in muscle systems. They can act in the circulatory system to increase the heartbeat. So this implies that the endocrine system does not necessarily need to act by using ducts. Whereas exocrine systems, which for example, salivary glands are examples of exocrine systems, wherein salivary glands have ducts in place inside the mouth. So these ducts supply the saliva into the mouth. The salivary gland is not an example of an endocrine system. Rather, it's an example of an exocrine gland. Other systems are also there is paracrine system or autocrine system. What autocrine system means is, if this is a cell and if the cell synthesizes something, what is going to happen is, whatever it synthesizes is going to affect itself, not anything else. So if the cell is secreting a molecule, then the molecule is only going to signal that particular cell. This is known as autocrine system. Auto means self. Paracrine, on the other hand, is when this cell is synthesizing, the first cell is synthesizing something, and this is going to affect this cell. So in case of paracrine systems, the action is for the neighboring cells. So bottom line, endocrine systems are ductless in nature. Whatever they secrete, it diffuses into the blood, and in most cases the endocrine system has low initial effects, but the effects persist much longer. And the hormones act on specific targets. These hormones are molecules. They essentially act as ligands. These ligands will have particular receptors that only some certain cells in the body will have. For example, we were talking about insulin a bit while ago. The insulin receptors might not be present everywhere in the body. It will only be present where it is needed to be present. Technically every cell inside the body can make insulin receptors. It's only that the epigenetic mechanisms in place make sure that only certain cells make it because they need it, whereas other cells don't. That's extra information which you might not need. These are the list of endocrine organs that are present inside a human body. Pineal gland, this is important especially in early years of an individual, but not so much in the later years. Hypothalamus, pituitary. Pituitary is again divided into anterior and posterior pituitary, and both of these portions secrete different molecules. There is thyroid gland, parathyroid glands near the thyroid gland, thymus, adrenal glands, cortex, medulla, pancreas, gonads, kidney, adipocytes, small intestine, etc. So, the hormones that are synthesized can be steroid hormones, or it can be other kinds of hormones. Steroid hormones are usually synthesized from cholesterol. What happens in case of these hormones is that they enter the cell and bind to the receptor, or if the receptor is present on the plasma membrane, then it will bind on the plasma membrane. The hormone receptor complex enters the nucleus, binds to the DNA. Usually this is either going to kickstart either going to signal various transcription factors to come in and start transcription of certain molecules, or the binding of the hormone receptor complex itself is a transcription factor. So what it will do is it will start synthesizing certain target mRNAs. This mRNA can then lead to protein production, which may act as a positive or a negative feedback loop. So once the hormone receptor complex enters the nucleus, binds to DNA, then protein synthesis occurs, and this increased protein synthesis alters the cell function. For example, testosterone production increases sperm production. There are non-steroid hormones as well. These are usually proteins, peptides, or amines. They don't enter the cell. This is usually a first messenger. It binds to the receptor on the cell membrane, and this triggers the formation of second receptor. One of the examples is cyclic AMP. There are other second messengers as well, which alters the cellular activities. Pituitary hormones are mostly non-steroidal hormones. Adrenal hormones are mostly steroidal hormones. Okay, so this is how the usual endocrine system looks like. Hypothalamus is known as the master of the master gland. Pituitary is known as the master gland. So what hypothalamus does is it signals for production of releasing hormones. RH is releasing hormone. This releasing hormone signals the pituitary gland to make various stimulating or inhibiting hormone. This stimulating hormone or inhibiting hormone then goes to the endocrine gland that has the receptors for these hormones, and the endocrine gland then produces the hormones that it's supposed to make, which can then affect the target cells. So hypothalamus is the one which has the master control over what hormones are produced and at what time. And there is a lot of negative feedback in place in this case. If there is a lot of hormone to present, for example, if adrenal gland is making a lot of hormone, then it will signal the pituitary gland to make sure that there is no stimulating hormone produced. So it will decrease the level of hormone 1. Excess presence of hormone 2 is also going to decrease the releasing hormone levels. Excess production of hormone 1 is also going to reduce the production of releasing hormone. So there are negative feedback mechanisms in place to make sure that whatever stimulus is being given is not amplified to an extent that it is harmful. Examples are thyroid releasing hormone, which will release thyroid stimulating hormone, in which case the thyroid gland is the endocrine target and it will start secreting thyroxine, etc. Gonadotropin releasing hormone will signal for follicular stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone to be produced from the pituitary, which will target either ovaries or testes, and depending on whether it's a male or a female, these will then release a variety of hormones from the ovaries and testes. So, hypothalamus, as I said, is the master of the master gland. It communicates with the anterior pituitary via hypothalamic hypophyseal portal vein, and it dumps protein hormones into the portal vein or the anterior pituitary. The releasing hormones stimulate hormone production in the anterior pituitary. So this will stimulate various stimulating hormones from the anterior pituitary, and it can also instead of releasing hormones, it can also synthesize IH or inhibiting hormones. These inhibiting hormones prevent hormone production in the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is also known as adenohypophysis. Under hypothalamus rule via the portal vein, it releases via the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal vein. There are other portal veins present inside the body as well. This anterior pituitary releases these 6 hormones. All of these are most of these go into the target organ and then signal for production of other hormones. TSH, ACTH, FSH, LH, PRL, GH, all of these are the hormones produced by the anterior pituitary. So, hypothalamus, which is under the direct control of nervous system, releases the releasing hormone to the pituitary. It is also under indirect control through release of various regulatory hormones. This is very essential for the negative feedback loop to be in place. The pituitary then might produce ACTH, which will affect the adrenal glands. The TSH will affect thyroid gland. Prolactin is going to affect the mammary glands. Growth hormone is going to affect the bone muscle tissues, and there are multiple such examples of what each one will do. Posterior pituitary is known as neurohypophysis. It communicates with the hypothalamus via nerve axons from the hypothalamus to posterior pituitary. It releases antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Just a minute. The thyroid gland is very essential for metabolic processing. It regulates the basal metabolic rate via thyroxine. It also regulates the calcium levels with parathyroid gland by releasing calcitonin when there is a very high calcium level in the blood. So, there is triiodothyronine or T3 and thyroxine or T4. Both of these are thyroid hormones and they help in maintaining the basal metabolic rate. Uh, if there is a requirement, then these hormones can increase the metabolic rate by regulating the blood, which regulates the blood temperature. Again, thyroid releasing hormone signals the pituitary to produce thyroid stimulating hormone, which then signals the thyroid gland to release T3 and T4. If there is normal T3 and T4, then there is normal body temperature. If there is disturbed T3 and T4, the body temperature varies because the metabolic reactions are going at a different rate. There are two major thyroid disorders, hypothyroidism and hyperthyroidism. Hypothyroidism, hypo anything is low, hyper anything is high. So hypo means hypothyroidism implies low thyroid hormone level, which results in weight gain, lethargy, and there's a potential for depression. Hyperthyroidism implies over secretion or more secretion of thyroid hormones, or this is also called as Graves' disease, which leads to hyperactivity, insomnia. The eyeballs are usually bulging in the individuals who have hyperthyroidism, and they also have goiter where there is a enlargement present in the neck. Usually in case of hyperthyroidism, was there a question? Usually in case of hyperthyroidism, removal of a part of the thyroid is the usual treatment. In case of hypothyroidism, because there is less production of T3 and T4, usually both T3 or usually one of these hormones which is low in level is supplied externally like a supplement. Adrenal gland is another important gland. A lot of the molecules that adrenal gland secretes are steroidal in nature. Examples are glucocorticoids or cortisol, mineral corticoids. One of the examples is aldosterone, and androgens or sex hormones. So the glucocorticoids are released from the zona fasciculate when under stress, and this is triggered by ACTH, which we saw here. So ACTH is released by the pituitary. This causes the tissues to increase blood glucose, liver storage of glucose, and decrease inflammation or immune response. This is more of a fight or flight response molecule, cortisol. Usually happens under stress, does not happen otherwise. Mineralocorticoids such as aldosterone are released from zona glomerulosa, which is a layer in the adrenal cortex when the blood volume is low. This helps increasing the blood volume by increasing sodium and water reabsorption and potassium excretion from the kidneys. And androgens, which are secreted by the zona reticularis, are responsible for producing sex hormones. Okay. If an individual is under a lot of stress, or if by their basal level of adrenal hormone production is high, then there is Cushing syndrome, which is hypercortisolism. In these cases, the patients have high glucocorticoid levels, which is usually either an adrenal disease or a pituitary disease. If there is a lot of stimulating hormone getting produced in the pituitary gland, then this is going to affect the signal the adrenal gland to produce more of the glucocorticoids, and therefore this is going to affect how the functionality of the individual is done. Or there is an excess of glucocorticoid drugs uh, externally taken. So the Cushing's patients store fat in cells, face and midsection, and only respond to high levels of insulin. Therefore, they have a risk of developing type 2 diabetes. Aldosterone is a mineralocorticoid which is produced by the adrenal gland. It's responsible for regulating blood volume, and this is triggered by angiotensin 2 if there is a drop in the blood volume. Then this promotes sodium reabsorption by the kidney tubules. So the aldosterone is going to be produced by the adrenal gland and then act on the kidneys of the individual. Sodium moves back into the blood, as hydrogen follows, water follows by osmosis. If there is a drop in blood pressure, then if there is a drop in blood pressure, this will signal renin production, which will lead to conversion of angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. The angiotensin 1 will then convert into angiotensin 2, which will trigger two things: thirst or vasoconstriction. If there is vasoconstriction, the blood pressure rises. Then there is salt or water, then the blood pressure rises. Another mechanism by which, if the blood pressure falls, it's restored is by kidneys when there is salt or water retention, where aldosterone especially comes in. This will then trigger the aldosterone production from the adrenal cortex, and then sodium water reabsorption in the kidneys. Okay. There is some innervation inside adrenal glands as well. The CNS synapses directly with the adrenal medulla. So the adrenal gland has two layers to it majorly. If you see here, yeah. So there is medulla, which is the internal portion, and there is the cortex, which is the outer portion. And each of these are responsible for different functions. Adrenal medulla releases epinephrine or adrenaline, which is the fight or flight hormone, and norepinephrine or noradrenaline. This stimulates the use of glycogen and glucose and release of lipids from adipocytes. This increases the heart rate, blood pressure, and vasoconstricts the blood vessels, so that the body is prepared to either fight or run away from that situation. Stress or low blood glucose can increase epinephrine and norepinephrine production. Posterior pituitary releases one hormone which is known as antidiuretic hormone. Diuresis usually means excessive urination or increased urination. So antidiuretic hormone essentially leads to less urine production. So this is directly secreted into blood when the blood osmolarity is high. This would usually happen if there is not a lot of water present in the body. The target of ADH is kidney, so it will signal the kidneys. What it does is it reabsorbs water back into the body to decrease the blood osmolarity, because there is a lot of solute inside the blood but not enough water, therefore increasing the osmolarity. So what the kidney will do is it will signal the nephrons to start taking up more water. Therefore, because there is not a water getting left behind, less urine is formed. Pancreas is has a exocrine and as well as endocrine function. The exocrine function is usually important for the digestive functions of the pancreas, whereas the endocrine portion is the islets of Langerhans. This comprises of alpha beta cells. Alpha cells release glucagon and beta cells release insulin. So both of these do different things. Insulin stimulates glucose uptake in cells. This glucose then converts into glycogen, which can be stored in the liver. Glucagon, on the other hand, triggers glycogen breakdown in the liver. In case there is glucose shortage inside the individual. Is there a question? Sorry, I can't see if there are questions. And there is somatostatin production inside islets of Langerhans, which inhibit both insulin and glucagon secretion depending on the situation. So what it does is it regulates blood glucose levels. If there is very low blood glucose, then glucagon is going to release into blood. This will increase blood glucose by asking the liver to break down all of the glycogen stored inside the liver. If there is high blood glucose level, then the body wants to take out the glucose that is present inside the blood. Insulin is released. What insulin does is it signals the cells to take up the glucose into themselves. The glucose is then converted into glycogen and stored in the liver. This is something that we already saw, but this is how the blood glucose homeostasis plays in. If there is any disturbance to either to all of these at any of these steps, then it will lead to disruption of the blood glucose homeostasis. One such condition is diabetes mellitus or type 2 diabetes. So there are two types of diabetes: diabetes mellitus or diabetes insipidus. Both of these are going to result in increased blood glucose levels. What happens in type 1 is there is not enough insulin getting produced in the body, because of which the blood glucose levels don't go down. Whereas in case of diabetes mellitus, even though there is a lot of insulin getting produced, the cells are not receptive of this insulin, because of which they can't do whatever signaling the insulin needs to do. So essentially this results in an increased blood glucose level. Okay. Are there any questions at this stage? Let's discuss the excretory system then. Okay. So up until now, whatever we have learned is uptake of things. If the body keeps taking up things and not releasing anything back, even if some of it is getting used, there will be a lot of things stored inside the cells, and therefore the cells will increase in the size a lot. Whatever byproducts are getting produced in each of the metabolic reactions are not may or may not be toxic to the cells. If they are indeed toxic to the cells, it is very important that they are thrown out. So in either of those conditions, if there is increased uptake or if there is a lot of toxic byproducts produced, there is a necessity of excretion. So excretion is essential for cells to stay alive. They need to take up, if they are taking up stuff, they need to throw some out as well. So the excretion might be excess amount that is present inside any cell, or it might be toxic or any byproducts, waste products that are produced by the metabolic reactions inside the body. So when you take up energy or grow, or if there is replication, all of these processes release their own waste products into the body. Uh, it might be CO2 when respiration is concerned. Might be ammonia if there is amino acid metabolism happening. So all of these processes are going to produce some waste products. If it's a carbon based reaction, then it's going to mostly lead to production of carbon dioxide. If it's a nitrogen based reaction, then it's mostly going to lead to production of ammonia or other nitrogenous products. So based on the excretory product, 5 modes of excretion are known in animals. Ammonotelism, in which case the excretion product is ammonia. Ureotelism, in which case it's urea. Uricotelism, which case it's uric acid. Aminotelism is secretion of amino acids, and guanotelism is excretion of guanine. This ammonotelism is very common in aquatic animals because ammonia won't be very soluble in the water, therefore it can get released. This is especially very common in case of fishes. Ureotelism is very common in land animals. Humans, for example, are ureotelic. Uricotelism, which is excretion using uric acid, is very common in places where there is very less water, for example in deserts. So lizards have uric acid type of excretion. So the main excretory products in animals are ammonia, carbon dioxide, urea, uric acid, guanine, and creatine. There will be some interconversion in all of, except for carbon dioxide because it's a carbon based product. Ammonia, urea, and uric acid may or may not interconvert amongst themselves. Carbon dioxide is a waste product of cellular respiration dumped into the bloodstream and eventually removed by the lungs. Ammonia is removed through water. The waste comes from the cells, and if in high concentration, ammonia is very toxic to the cells. There are different excretory organs apart from the respiratory system that are essential for removal of the nitrogen based excretion product. Vertebrates have kidneys, and in most cases it's urea is the excretory product. For planaria, the excretory organ are the flame cells. Earthworms have nephridia, cockroaches have Malpighian tubules, and prawns have antennal glands. So what do the excretory organs do? They are responsible for cleaning up the blood by removing metabolic waste, excess solutes, excess water, and excreting them as urine. So if there is a lot of uptake, but all of that material taken up is not used up, then that will go into the excretory system to be thrown out. If it can be stored, it will get stored. If it can't be stored, it will get thrown out. If there is, so all of these reactions have metabolic waste getting produced. That it might be ammonia, it might be carbon dioxide. So all of these wastes also need to be removed, and this is where excretory organs come in. Besides removing urea, it also removes excess salts or glucose, the remnants of drug. These drugs might be medicine or other recreational drugs, in which case the urine test will tell us if the individual is taking any drugs or not. And excess water, if you are taking in a lot of water, that this is also going to get removed by the excretory system. Just as this is how the human excretory system looks. There are kidneys, a pair of kidneys. There is a vein and artery to make sure the blood comes in and goes out. The ureter takes up whatever urine is getting produced in the kidneys to the urinary bladder, which stores the kidneys until there is a signal to release it to the urethra. The two kidneys in the body receive between 1 to 2 liters essentially of blood per day, about the 1,100 to 2,000 liters of blood per day. So the blood runs through the kidneys once in every 3-4 minutes, depending on the volume of the blood. On an average, human body has around 5.6 liters of blood. So by that calculation, the kidneys clean the blood every 4 minutes. The basic part of the kidney is known as a nephron. The nephron has glomerulus and tubules in place to make sure that there is reabsorption of whatever can be reabsorbed, and rest of the things are thrown into the tubule to make up the kidney, make up the urine. So if the blood becomes too dilute or too concentrated with solutes, then the normal cellular activity is going to get affected. If it's too dilute, then it will be a hypotonic solution. Hypotonic solution means that the osmolarity outside is very less as compared to the inside. So this might cause the cells to swell up. If it's too concentrated, then the osmolarity outside is very high as compared to the inside. That implies that the solution is hypotonic. Then in that case, the cells will start shrinking in response to the outside environment. So it is very essential that the blood is maintained at the optimal osmolarity, in which case it will be an isotonic solution wherein the osmolarity inside of the cell and the outside will be the same. So if it's too dilute, then the kidneys know that they need to throw out the water. If it's too concentrated, the kidneys know that either they need to reabsorb water from that is getting produced, that would have gone into the urine, or they need to absorb the solutes present in the blood. So the kidneys are able to regulate water concentration in the blood by removing excess water if the blood is too dilute, or conserving water in the blood if it's not dilute enough. A lot of reabsorption also takes place in the kidneys, where they take up various solutes which would have gone into the urine. If the amount of solutes that is normally found in the urine is not usually found, then that implies that there is something wrong with the absorption reabsorption going on at the kidneys. So at the cellular level, urea is not produced inside humans. Ammonia is produced, but the ammonia is carried to the liver, where it is converted from ammonia to urea, which is much less toxic. This urea can then go to kidneys, where it can be removed. So the toxicity level is such that ammonia has the highest toxicity, then urea, and then uric acid. But each of these reactions take more energy. Uric acid production takes even more energy than urea production. So in places where urea production can be afforded, it is preferred that urea is produced over uric acid. If there is too much water in the blood, then it's removed and put in urine. If there is not enough water in the blood, then the kidneys will not remove it, rather they'll reabsorb the water. If there is too much urea or other solutes in the blood, the kidneys will again throw it out. If the blood is too dilute and some solutes are missing, then the kidneys can take up certain solutes to maintain the homeostasis. So there is always a osmolarity maintained in the blood. Kidney function can be affected by a lot of factors. If there is less water inside the body, then antidiuretic hormone can be signaled to be produced, which prevents excess water loss from the kidneys. This leads to less urine production. Alcohol can also can inhibit the secretion of ADH, which increases the urine volume. Aldosterone prevents excess loss of sodium and water from the kidneys, so less urine produced. Caffeine increases rate of salt and water loss from the kidneys, so more urine produced. So when someone consumes alcohol or caffeine, that leads to production of more urine. Increased blood pressure, that implies there is increased rate of water loss from the kidney. That results in increased rate of water loss from the kidneys to make sure that the blood pressure comes down. There are other mechanisms in place inside the on the body to make sure that the body maintains its function. One such system is the integumentary system, which is essentially the sweat glands, hair, nail, etc. The sweat glands especially are also a part of the excretory system, in the sense that if there is a lot of solute in the blood, it can be excreted out from the sweat glands, and therefore a lot of salt, uh, if a lot of salt is there, the sweat glands throw it out. The integumentary system essentially forms the first layer on the body. It can therefore prevent the body from outside interference, or if needed, systems like sweat glands can throw out some excretory product. Okay, so if in case there is any disturbance, the body needs to have mechanisms in place for the readjustment. This is this can be twofold. It can be either at the endocrine level, which will trigger coordination between various organ systems, or it can be at the level of excretory system, which will make sure that solutes remain inside the body and the water is thrown in or out, depending, or is either kept in or thrown out depending on the osmolarity of the body. All of this finally results in the homeostatic mode to be maintained, homeostatic state to be maintained. Are there any questions at this stage? Okay. If there are no questions, I'll discuss some questions. Please stop me if there are any doubts. These are MCQs, so you can try answering it in the chat box if you know the answer. So the body system that primarily regulates homeostasis is the circulatory system, muscular system, digestive system, or nervous and endocrine systems. Able to see the chat box. Correct. Nervous and endocrine systems. The nervous system is going to sense whatever, if there is something going off, then the endocrine system is going to kick in. The role of hypothalamus in homeostasis is regulating voluntary muscle movement, storing nutrients, acting as a sensor and integrator for body temperature and other variables, or producing antibodies. Someone wants to answer this? Okay. The answer is C. It acts as a sensor and integrator for the body temperature and other variables. Correct. The answer is C. The following is an example of a positive feedback: childbirth contractions, sweating during exercise, regulation of blood sugar, maintenance of blood pressure. Correct. The answer is A, childbirth contractions, wherein uh, initiation of contractions triggers more contractions so that the baby can be pushed out of the uterus. The feedback mechanism that is responsible for regulating body temperature: positive feedback, negative feedback, neutral feedback, or dual feedback. Correct. The answer is B, negative feedback. If the body temperature rises, it's going, the mechanism is trying to get it down by sweating, or if it lowers down, then by sweating or by vasodilation, wherein the diameter of the blood vessels is going to increase, or if it's going down, then the set point, then it is going to, then the body is going to start shivering to warm up, or it might vasoconstrict or decrease the diameter of the blood vessels to make sure that there is no heat loss from the skin. There is very minimal heat loss from the skin. Vasodilation helps in regulating the body temperature by conserving heat, reducing heat loss from the skin, increasing blood flow to the skin to release heat, or preventing sweating. Correct. The answer is C, increasing blood flow to the skin to release the heat. During vasoconstriction, in response to cold temperatures, for example, the following happens. Heat is conserved by reducing blood flow near the skin surface. Heat is lost by increasing blood flow near the skin surface, or sweat glands are activated, or oxygen levels decrease in the tissue. The answer is A, heat is conserved by reducing blood flow near the skin surface. Correct. The gland that is responsible for regulating body's metabolic rate is pituitary gland, thyroid gland, adrenal gland, or pancreas. Correct. The answer is B, thyroid gland. The effect of glucocorticoids like cortisol is stimulating insulin release, decreasing blood pressure, increasing glucose availability during stress, or inhibiting glycogen breakdown. Correct. The answer is C, increasing glucose availability during stress. It also might signal other phenomenon within the body, such as getting the muscles ready to perform whatever function the body needs to perform within where there is stress. But in general, it will increase the glucose availability so that the body can use up this glucose in case of emergency. The part of the brain that regulates the pituitary gland is hypothalamus, cerebellum, medulla oblongata, or corpus callosum. The answer is A, hypothalamus. Hypothalamus in turn can be regulated by other portions of the brain depending on what the signal is. The body handles toxic ammonia generated during metabolism by excreting directly through the skin, converting into oxygen in lungs, converting into urea in liver, or converting into uric acid. Correct. It's C, converting into urea in liver. The role of antidiuretic hormone ADH, the role that ADH plays in kidney function is increase urine production, reduce water reabsorption, inhibit salt reabsorption, or promotes water reabsorption in kidneys. Correct. It promotes water reabsorption in kidneys. Sorry, the answer is promotes water reabsorption in kidneys, because so that so if you see diuresis, it implies that it's going to decrease diuresis means increase in urine production. If it's antidiuretic, then it's going to decrease the urine production. Excretory product commonly found in desert dwelling animals to conserve water is uric acid, ammonia, urea, or carbon dioxide. Correct. It's uric acid. There is some extent of uric acid also produced in other mammals, which in which case the primary excretory product is urea. There is some uric acid produced, but not a lot. In desert dwelling animals, uric acid is the primary excretory product, whereas in case of other animals, it's urea. In case of fishes, it will be ammonia. Condition that results in excess water in blood and dilute urine is dehydration, hypotonic blood solution condition, hypertonic blood condition, or high ADH secretion. Correct. Answer is hypotonic blood condition. So the osmolarity is low. So there is excess water in the blood. During dehydration, the body experiences hypertonic condition. The kidney responds to maintain balance by one of the following ways. Excess water is reabsorbed to maintain the balanced solute concentration. Water is excreted in large amounts. Solutes are retained to dilute the blood, or ADH secretion is reduced. Correct. The answer is A. Excess water is reabsorbed to balance the solute concentration. A patient visiting a doctor reports dark yellow urine after a prolonged period of limited water intake. The cause of urine to become more concentrated and appear darker in color is due to increased reabsorption of water by kidneys, increased toxin excretion, reduced pigment production, or increased urea synthesis. Correct. The answer is A. Increased reabsorption of water by kidneys. Okay. Um, are there any questions from any portion of the contents of the three uh, slide decks? If there are any questions, please ask. Okay. I'm here for a couple of more minutes. If there are any questions, please feel free to either ask by speaking or by dropping in the question in the chat box. Anything is fine. Otherwise, this is the end of the session. Thank you for listening in. Okay. If there are no questions, I'm ending the session here. Thank you.